Châteaubriant peva duc Breise, à Crouer Urs en Herminique, et Meuse en Énor, à Garblija de Vraz, da Guinic deor Collier en Herminique, et vit à Labour d'Iba, au Reus grec, et vit Breise, à Garbroyou Keltiek, ravi odamant, trugareket.
The embarrassment of seeing ourselves as others see us. Ladies and gentlemen, I would very much like to thank members of the Collier de Renommée for electing me to this honour. It is an honour which I appreciate enormously. I would also like to thank the Institut Culturel de Bretagne for organising this event, and the Ville de Châteaubriant for their hospitality today. Those of us who have the fortune to live along the Atlantic façade of Europe are lucky indeed, because the Atlantic provides a corridor of connectivity that has helped to bind our ocean-facing communities together for many thousands of years. And that is something which, as an archaeologist, I'm privileged to look at, the deep, deep past. At the end of the Ice Age, the early hunter-gatherers who lived along this great ocean facade very quickly learned to use the sea to their advantage. And following the shoals of fish, they went further and further and came into contact with other people on other shores, with other habits and beliefs and behaviours. And making this contact, they developed usually friendly relationships, which often would lead to gift-giving and to feasting and so on. So it was the sea that really led us to learn about each other. In Ireland, we get the most remarkable evidence of this early contact. It is when the early hunter-gatherers were living around the coast, and we find as archaeologists bones of domesticated cattle in their middens. How did they get there? The simplest answer is that they were brought by sea from farmers nearby. And the only farmers nearby were in Brittany at that stage. We're talking about the 5th millennium BC. So those few bones in those isolated Irish sites reflect that our first visible contact of the people moving along the corridor of the Atlantic. There is, of course, another possible explanation, and that is that the Irish may have got on their boats and gone and raided the Bretons and stole their cattle and brought them back. But that would be the beginning of the great Irish tradition of cattle raiding. But I much prefer the first explanation, the friendly relationship, taking joints of meat, unusual joints of meat, for feasting and making friendships. And so it began. That was in the 5th millennium BC. By the 4th millennium BC, the seas were absolutely alive with travellers. The archaeological evidence leaves no doubt about that at all. And with them, complex concepts and belief patterns, concepts of death and the afterlife, visions of art, and knowledge of cosmology, the movement of the stars and the moon and the sun and the rhythm of the seasons. That knowledge spread along the Atlantic seaways with the great megalithic tombs that were being built. And archaeologists have recently concluded, I think fairly, that this idea of the megalithic passage grave with all these very complex concepts originated in Brittany, and it spread south into Galicia and further down in Spain. It spread north to the Irish Sea, to Britain, Ireland, and Scotland. And I like to think of these places not being just places of death, but places of celebration of ancestors, celebration of friendships, alive with music and with that wonderful pentatonic scale which is so typical of Atlantic music. We're talking now about the 4th millennium BC. By the 3rd millennium BC, people were still moving along these seaways from Spain right up to the north of Scotland, and they were still exchanging ideas about the chemistry of rocks, about extracting metals like copper, and using metals like copper and tin to make alloys of a much stronger, better metal that cast more easily. This was very, very complex knowledge. And this was part of what was passing and being exchanged. It was a remarkable cultural phenomenon. And I think all of us would agree that that kind of knowledge exchange and patterns of beliefs and behaviours spreading could not have happened without a common language. And that common language developed in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Age and became the language which we at present choose to call Celtic, although there have been times when I thought that Atlantean would have been a better word for it, but let us call it the Celtic language. When Celtic actually began to be spoken in the Atlantic as this language of communication of the sea, it's difficult to say, and there is no firm opinion about it. But linguists now tell us, without any doubt at all, that a mature form of Celtic language was being spoken in Spain before the end of the Bronze Age. So we are way back in time, but that language which we all share now, the Celtic dialects which we share, has been going for at least 3,000 years and probably a lot longer. The sea encourages a restlessness. There is always movement in the sea lanes. Sometimes this restlessness took the form of refugees. For example, the British who fled when the Saxons moved in, they fled from Cornwall and Devon, and they moved down across the sea to Brittany, and they found places to live and made their homes in Brittany. That was in the 5th century AD. 1,000 years later, 15th century AD, a young Welshman, 14-year-old, called Henry Tudor, with his uncle, fled from Britain. They were fleeing from their enemies. They came to Brittany. And they were welcomed by they were noblemen, I should say. They were welcomed by the Dukes of Brittany, they were given hospitality, and they were given protection. 13 years later, when he was 27, Henry Tudor went back to Britain and fought for the throne and became the English king, Henry VII. Henry VII, when he became King of England, had spent nearly half his life here in Brittany and had been brought up in Breton culture. This is the sort of link that binds us all along the Atlantic Seaway. There were other movements as well, movements of craftsmen, for example. In the 16th century, Breton craftsmen, a number of Breton craftsmen, moved to the southwest of Britain and carved some of the most beautiful church carvings, wooden carvings, that we have. They were sharing their culture with their nearby neighbours, as their ancestors had done for thousands of years before. Go on another century, and then a man called Robert Dallon, who was an organ maker, a maker of church organs. he left Britain with his family and came and settled in Brittany and made some of the most beautiful organs that you can still hear in Brittany, in Llanfelic, for example. So, in addition to the travellers, the adventurers, the refugees, the craftspeople, in addition, people have always moved, and these movements have helped to bind our communities closely together over the centuries. This was well understood, of course, by the Breton scholar Sir Barry Cunliffe. And in 1867, he set up the first Inter-Celtic Congress in Saint-Brieuc. In his own words, he sent invitations to his compatriots in Wales, his brothers in Cornwall, his cousins in Ireland and Scotland, and invited them to attend this great celebration of the Celtic language and of the deep interwoven history that bound the peoples of the seas. He was doing this at a time when, of course, the Breton language and Breton culture was coming under pressure from the French. And now I think, with our minority languages increasingly under threat of extinction, it's even more important that organisations like this should not only celebrate and cherish our unique shared heritage, but should make sure that it thrives in the modern world. I am proud to be admitted to a community dedicated to such an aim. Thank you.